Okay, we meet again. So I'm going to deal with the history of ancient Israel. The emergence of the Jewish religion is going to be the main subject today, but I want to start with answering two review questions. And I believe I want to start with question 7, which asks you to explain the longevity of Egyptian civilization. Well, you begin by confirming that Egyptian civilization lasted a long time. It was extremely stable. And you begin by noting that united Egyptian kingdom came into being 3100 BC with King Menes, and it lasted until, as an independent state, until the Persian Empire conquered it, uniting the whole of the Middle East in the 6th century BC. So there was this enormously long history. Now, what explains the stability is the isolation of Egypt, certainly through the Old Kingdom, but even in the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, the presence of foreigners was extremely rare. And secondly, that was confirmed by the fact that there was little trade. Towns and trade did develop. There was virtually none of that in the Old Kingdom, but in the Middle and the New Kingdom, a certain amount of foreign contacts, trade, merchants, cities, some cities did develop, but nothing like in Mesopotamia. And the urban classes, particularly the merchants who had money, who might cause problems, there weren't that many of them in Egypt. So that what you find is a state where you have the absolute authority of the centralized authority of the pharaoh, testimony in the Old Kingdom, the building the pyramids, which were to the glory of the pharaohs. But then below, beneath them, was the priesthood. There were many, many temples, but they were really under the control of the pharaoh, and likewise the bureaucrats. And both of these groups were extremely conservative. On the other hand, one could note that eventually the history of Egypt does show from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom. First of all, there was foreign invasions around 2100 BC. Again, the HIST invaded in the 1600s BC, and eventually also the Philistines and the Dorian Greeks and the Hittites. But these were highly exceptional periods. For the most part, foreign influences are extremely limited. Foreign contacts are extremely limited. The institutional support, the priests and the bureaucrats were conservative and generally supported the monarchy. So all that having been said, the society was relatively secure from being overthrown by internal forces or external invasion until the coming of the Iron Age. So that's the answer to that question. The other question I want to look at is the previous question, question 6. um, who was Akhenaton? And Akhenaton, of course, was a pharaoh in the 14th century BC. And the story of Akhenaton proves the rule. That is to say, that Egyptian society was um, deeply conservative, because Akhenaton was all about challenging the whole structure of religion and the place of the priests in Egyptian society. As I explained previously, there were literally thousands of different temple cults. Many of them, the local gods, they were sort of animal gods, like crocodiles and so on, or lions or what have you. But then the pharaoh had his own, he was himself considered to be a godlike figure, controlling fertility. And he was identified with these leading gods, the god Horus, the god Amun-Ra, and was considered the offspring of Osiris and Isis. So um, under the under the pharaohs, um, the um, the priesthood had this huge power in Egypt, and generally, most of the time, they supported the government. But um, as I explained last time, in sort of detailing the history of Egypt, um, Egypt had been invaded by the Hyksos um, in the 16th century BC. Um, the Hyksos occupied the northern part of Egypt. They disrupted the society, and they were finally expelled in the 14th century BC. And after their expulsion, the new kingdom took various measures in order to protect itself. It invaded and occupied neighboring territories like Palestine and Syria. It developed its international contacts. The government was highly centralized, even more so than in the past. And Akhenaton was a central figure in this centralization. And he decided that the priests, particularly the priests of the sun god, which was very Aton, or sorry, Amun-Ra, had become too independent, and that the priesthood in general was too independent of the authority of the pharaohs. So he introduced what we can call a kind of monotheistic worship of a new sun god who was considered to be all powerful, sort of paralleling the power of the pharaoh, centralizing religious authority in this way. And so the each and we have some texts which clearly show this kind of monotheistic tendency. Some historians have argued that there is a link between this and the later Hebrew monotheism. Other historians don't accept this, but I'm just mentioning it. But ultimately, Akhenaton failed, and the situation from a religious point of view reverted to the previous status, the status quo ante, as it had been before Akhenaton. But we can draw the lesson that the episode of Akhenaton does demonstrate a growing dynamism in the new kingdom. There was a new, more realistic art. There were more international commercial and political relationships. And this episode demonstrates that despite the overly static quality of Egyptian society, there was some development in the Bronze Age. Are there any questions about this review I gave you. Good. I now want to turn to the history of the ancient history of the Hebrews, who later became known as the Jews. And I say this is the ancient history of the Jews. I'm not going to deal with the experience of the Jews under the Greeks or the Romans at this point. That will be for later. And of course, I'm not dealing with the relationship between the Christians and the Jews as Christianity became more and more powerful in the late Roman Empire and during the Middle Ages. That's still another story. We'll leave that perhaps for later. I'm just concentrating on the development of the Jewish religion because they did develop this monotheistic culture, which religious belief, which is interesting in itself, but also in terms of understanding the context in which Christianity was to later emerge. Knowing something about the history, the early history of the Jews is important, so I'm dealing with it. Now, the Hebrew state and the occupation of Palestine by the Hebrews, it was never complete, by the way. Other people continued to live, the so-called Canaanites and so on, and others. The Hebrew state or states was an Iron Age culture. They learned in the 10th century how to smelt iron, and they learned this from their aggressive neighbors, the Philistines, who had invaded the coast of Palestine. Palestine is named after the Philistines. And they were an Iron Age people, and the Hebrews learned how to make iron weapons and then tools from the Philistines. Likewise, the alphabet, which I discussed earlier, was invented in Lebanon. Basically, this is the area known as Phoenicia in ancient times. And it was here that the first alphabets, well, the Hebrews learned their writing from the Philistines, later the Phoenicians. Now, furthermore, the other point I was making last time is that the Hebrew monarchy, which came into existence in the 10th century, it actually expanded its borders under, as you'll see, King Saul and David and Solomon. It became a fairly significant state, but this power did not extend very far, and to the east was Mesopotamia, and to the southwest was Egypt, and these states potentially were far more powerful than they had way more population and economic resources. And so this period of political greatness was relatively brief. It lasted a little over a century. Thereafter, the Hebrew monarchies had to face increasingly strong powers in Egypt, but especially in Mesopotamia. So there was this brief period of, we can call it political glory, followed by a whole series of disasters, as you'll see. In terms of their response to these disasters, well, the Hebrews really couldn't respond effectively politically. They didn't have the power to respond politically. In this very interesting way, this very creative way, they responded in religious terms, in spiritual terms. They interpreted these events in religious terms. And as you'll see, in the course of doing so, they basically came to the idea of ethical monotheism, which is the sort of highlight in terms of the development of the Hebrew or Jewish religion. Now, we've first run across the Hebrews in the documents, the clay documents, the cuneiform documents that have been preserved in Mesopotamia. There is in these documents reference to the Hebrews. The term Hebrew seems to mean people who live beyond the river. This is what in the Mesopotamian language, this is what Hebrew meant. And it seems that the Hebrews were one of a group of different tribes. They were tribal people, they were pastoralists. They herded sheep and goats and camels and so on, who had basically originated in the Arabian Peninsula, the current Saudi Arabia, and pressed up through the deserts into they were attracted by the wealthy agricultural river valleys of Mesopotamia, and they were considered to be a nuisance, marauders, and so on. In fact, as I say, they were pastoralists, they were wanderers, and they were marginal to the agricultural civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia. They lived in the deserts. And they were organized, they were essentially tribal peoples. These people lived in tribes, led by patriarch chiefs and so on. Some of these Hebrews found their way into Egypt. They crossed the Sinai Desert and they entered Egypt, and they were brought under the control and enslaved. I'm saying some of the Hebrews because we know that some of the Hebrews never went to Egypt, but some of them at least went down into Egypt. The experience of these Hebrews in Egypt became part as what I would call of the mythical foundation of what we call the Hebrew Confederacy. Under a character whose name was Moses, following their exodus from Egypt, they ran off from Egypt. They were able to sort of free themselves from Egyptian slave control. Under their leader, Moses, these tribes, and there were 12 of them, unified themselves into what we call a tribal confederacy. A tribal confederacy. And this was the escape from Egypt and this organization into a tribal confederacy was the founding event of what we call the Hebrew religion, if you like. It was both a political tribal confederacy and a common religion that these people swore themselves to. And they swore themselves to this religion by means of a covenant with their God, the God that they accepted. The word is covenant. They took an oath. A covenant is an oath. Um, this is under the auspices of their leader, Moses. And the God that they all agreed to worship was this God, Jehovah. Right here. The covenant with Jehovah. And this was a religious act, but it also was a political act, because in these 12 tribes recognizing Jehovah as their God, he supposedly lived in a portable ark, which was carried from one tribe to another. It was shared between the 12 tribes. Um, the um, they promised that they would only worship Jehovah. They would exclusively worship Jehovah as their gods. And it seems clear that these Hebrews at this time actually thought, of course, they were giving their loyalty to Jehovah, and they promised to be exclusively devoted to Jehovah, but they also knew, so far as they were concerned, there were other gods as well. The other peoples that they knew about also had gods, and there was this sort of attitude. Every political entity, every tribe has its god, and the Hebrews had their God, who was a jealous God. He was an exclusive God. He demanded complete loyalty from the Hebrews, but he was not, at this point, we cannot speak of monotheism at this point. Now, in return for obedience to this God, and particularly, he gave the Hebrews the so-called 10 Commandments, which I think most of you are familiar with: shalt not kill, and so on, honor thy mother and father, and so on. There are 10 of these commandments. I forgot which is which, but there were these 10 commandments, which the Hebrews, one of the commandments was to exclusively worship Jehovah. So in return for their loyalty, Jehovah gives them the 10 commandments with which they're to live. And he also, he promises them the land of Canaan, contemporary Israel. It's inhabited by the Canaanites, that they will be able to conquer the land of Canaan. And this is the covenant that follows the exodus from Egypt. It's regarded as the founding act of the Hebrew religion and culture. Now, following this this event, which occurred probably after 1150 BC, the Hebrews were told in the first books of their Bible, proceeded to conquer Canaan, the land of Canaan, or which would be tantamount to basically to modern Israel. I am, of course, not getting into the current disputes and so on. I have my own opinions about this.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Prof. Sorry, your audio was very bad, so we didn't hear you for the past couple minutes.
I beg your pardon?
Your audio was very bad, so we couldn't really understand what you were saying.
Oh, it's breaking up, is it?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you more clear.
So you can hear me now. I'll just sort of introduce a parenthesis. Yes, all of the, as you know, this is contemporary Israel, and the Palestinians are under the control of the Israelis. It's supposed to be a deal. I'm sure how could you avoid not knowing about this? And it's, of course, a very fraught, and it's a huge international issue. The claims of the Israelis go back to these events. You know, it's a kind of ethno-nationalism, Zionism. That these events are the inspiration for the sort of Zionist Israel. Do you hear what I'm saying? Is there a problem? Hello, could somebody tell me whether I'm being heard? Hello?
Hi, hi, we can hear you now, but it's kind of cutting in and out a little bit.
It just broke up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I think that people will probably, no problem.
Okay, okay. Please give me feedback if I go off. Tell me, okay? Now, we're told again in the Bible that they conquered these lands. However, the archaeologists tell a different story. They don't, there's very little based on archaeology, and archaeology is highly developed in this area. Started in the 19th century with Protestant archaeologists from England and from the United States who were very interested in the Bible, of course. And archaeology is very highly developed. There seems little evidence of a conquest based on the archaeological evidence. So some historians are taking the line now that really there was no conquest, there was a peaceful infiltration of the Hebrews. Who can say what the truth is at this point? This seems, well, you have to understand that a lot of this kind of discussion, and the historians, although they claim objectivity, I think there's this political agendas, and I mentioned this earlier. You have to be quite wary about what I'm saying and what anybody else tells you. This is a certain narrative that I'm developing here. It isn't I can't certify the absolute truth of this narrative. I have my own prejudices, and other scholars feel differently. You have to be really aware, not only in this course, but in all your courses, that you're getting a line is basically what I'm saying. And you have to carefully analyze what is being said. I'm trying to maintain a certain quote unquote objectivity in what I'm saying. So in any case, some historians say, well, no, it wasn't a conquest. It was more in the way of a kind of infiltration. Well, the Hebrews kept to themselves. They lived basically inland. The Phoenicians, the Canaanites were, they lived in towns and close to the Mediterranean coast. The Hebrews tend to live as agriculturalists and even as pastoralists in their tribal formations in the interior of this land, Palestine. However, we can say, first of all, yes, there was this, the tribal religion, the worship of Yahweh continued in the Ark, which is shared by the different tribes. I would say the tribalism persisted. These different tribes, although they worshiped this common God, there were political tensions between these different Hebrew tribes. And moreover, the Philistines, again, the internet connection, it says unstable. Let me know. In any case, the Philistines began to intrude into the territories, the agricultural lands, and the pastoral lands of the Hebrews, and conflict broke out. And the Philistines, who were an urban people who knew how to use and to manufacture and to use iron weapons, at first were able to get the upper hand. But over time, the Hebrews threw up some effective leaders, the first of whom was a character by the name of Saul. Later, there was David, his protege. These people became in the fight with the Philistines. The tribes decided that under the leadership of these generals, Saul and David, they would create a monarchy. So they elected Saul as the first king of Israel, followed by King David. And under their leadership, the Hebrews rallied and were able to conquer most of Palestine. So they moved from a tribal confederacy suddenly to a kingdom, and the capital of the kingdom becomes the city of Jerusalem, the town, hamlet. It was based on the archaeological evidence. It was nothing. But they, under David, they begin to build a temple, a religious temple, and install Yahweh in the temple. And they clearly now are becoming similar to other states in and around the Mediterranean. Kings, rather than a tribal confederacy, they have a king, they have a temple, and temple religion was the common form of religion in the Middle East. They develop a priesthood and so on. The Hebrew monarchy under Saul, David, and
Prof,
then
we can't hear you at all.
You cannot hear me. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me?
No.
You cannot hear me. Oh.
Now we can, but for the past couple minutes, we couldn't hear you at all.
You could. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to let me just. I'm going to speak about stuff that is not. It's a parenthesis. I'm just going to continue speaking, but I'm not going to speak about anything that was part of the narrative. Okay, until there's a restoration of service. Please inform me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Henry.
You can hear me? Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Mehmet. The Hebrew monarchy became relatively powerful. And as I noted earlier, at this time, there was no powerful empire in Mesopotamia nor in Egypt. And so that partly facilitated the expansion of this Hebrew state. And we hear that King Solomon, it started under David, but Solomon completes the temple. He's trading with everybody. He even gets a queen from Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba. It's sort of a legendary event. This is all in the Old Testament. By the way, the Old Testament was written down. It's generally believed around the 8th century BC. In any case, this was the height of the glory of the Hebrews from a political point of view, and it became part of their memory. And part of their sort of the development of their religion is sort of related to the idea that somehow if they if they reaffirm their relationship with God, he will restore them politically. He will restore the power of King David, of King Solomon, which they lose. Now, what happens is basically that following this foundation of a strong monarchy and the temple, the forces of division turn out to be very strong. That these feelings of separatism between the different tribes. There were two main tribes, the tribe of Israel and the tribe of Judah. And the other tribes were lesser tribes, but there was a lot of tension within the tribes. Furthermore, they were living alongside the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And these people were sophisticated. They also worshiped temples. It's clear that some of these Hebrews were attracted to the temples of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And I would say also the Hebrews tended to practice a strict sexual morality, as you'll see more or less a little bit later. Nothing doing when it came to homosexuality or any other illicit practices, where these seem to have been commonplaces amongst the Philistines and the Canaanites. And there was this, what I would call it, seductive influence of the religion, of the morality of the Philistines and the Canaanites. And so at the end of the 10th century, a split occurred. And the two tribes of Israel and Judah split into two separate states. To the north was the kingdom of Israel, and to the south, the kingdom of Judah, which this area, which came to be known as Judea. The center of it is, of course, the capital, Jerusalem. These two kingdoms emerged, rival kingdoms, and there was no love lost between these two kingdoms. They split. They were rivals. And meanwhile, this division weakened the Hebrews politically and militarily. And meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, great new empires arose. And by the 8th century, the great new empire that did arise was known as the Assyrian Empire. I'm looking, here it is. The Assyrian Empire, 8th century BC. Well, they began to try and expand all over the Middle East, and Israel stood in their way. And so, that is to say, the northern kingdom stood in their way. So in 722, they attacked this Hebrew kingdom, Israel, and they obliterated it. They destroyed it, and they took all the people away to Mesopotamia. The 10 tribes of Israel, these 10 out of the 12 tribes were simply deported to Mesopotamia and never heard from again. They were the so-called lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes. They became legendary. What happened to the 10 lost tribes and so on? Well, it's perfectly obvious that basically they were chopped up and they dispersed amongst the peoples of Mesopotamia. But in terms of, because this is all recorded in the Bible, later on people read the Bible and they said, well, the Scots must be part of the 10 Lord tribes, or the Irish were part of the 10 Lord tribes, or they thought that the the indigenous people, when they discovered the indigenous people of North America, said, well, of the Americas, they said, well, these are the 10 lost tribes. We found the 10 lost tribes. This kind of, so I'm just giving you the legend because it appears in literature right through Western civilization. So the 10 lost tribes is a theme. In any case, that's the end of the northern state. The state of Israel disappears, but Judah remains with its capital in Jerusalem. Alas, the kingdom of Judah meets the same fate because the Assyrians are ultimately overthrown and a new power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, centered on the city of Babylon, arises in the 6th century, and they do the same thing as the Assyrians. They destroy the kingdom of Judah in 586, and most of the Judeans are deported to Mesopotamia, or Iraq, as we call it today. You can see from the time of Solomon and David and so on, you have this political glory, then you have this division, and then growing pagan influence, Canaanites, Phoenicians, and ultimately they're conquered by the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. The Hebrews can do little or nothing about this from a political and military point of view. They respond in a creative religious way. This is I'm coming to this from the point of view of the significance of the Hebrews, and now we can begin to talk about the Jews, because in their exile in Babylon, in Mesopotamia, they begin to be called Jews, and we can stop calling them Hebrews, and we can now begin to call them the Jews. Okay, so the Jews remain, in most of them, remain under the control of the Neo-Babylonians until from 586 to 531. So what I want to address is the fact that the using their imagination, using their creativity, they're inspired, or a series of great religious leaders arise amongst the Jews. From the 8th century down to the 6th century, this is called the Age of the Prophets, the Age of the Prophets. And it's these people who basically invent monotheism. They invent, and we can call it ethical monotheism, which from a religious point of view is the great achievement of the Jews, the invention of ethical monotheism, worship of a single God who controls the universe. Now, there's a series of prophets we can't, where the most important of them, I mention here some of the most important: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, culminating in this prophet Isaiah, which if you read the Old Testament, this is a real piece of literature. I would say I would recommend it. It's a real piece of literature. A lot of the Bible isn't that, in my opinion, that interesting, but this is a genuine piece of literature. The prophets, basically the basic theme of the prophets is that, of course, the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians have conquered the Jews, the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians believe that they are in control of events. They control history. But really, behind this screen of the surface of political and military events it's the will of God that is in action, that it is Jehovah who is really the temple God in the eyes of many still, who is really controlling all of these events. He is the one who has destroyed the Hebrew monarchies and brought the Jews to this abysmal state. And why is that? Because the Jews have fallen into sin, and their worst immorality, sin, injustice, including exploiting one another economically, also sexual deviancy, and because of their sinfulness, and especially because they have turned away from their loyalty to Jehovah, they've broken the covenant with Jehovah. God is showing his anger at the Jews by causing their destruction. And the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians are really instruments of this all-powerful God. He's not simply a temple God in Jerusalem. He's the all-powerful God. And so what these prophets are asserting basically is that we have to look at things in a deeper sense, in a religious and spiritual sense. We can't simply talk about military and political power, but it's this supernatural causation by this all-powerful monotheistic God that has caused all these events. This kind of thinking by the prophets, they tend to repeat one another, but in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is actually written by, according to these scholars, by two authors, possibly three. Isaiah 2, which is the heart of it. Here we see many of the themes that I've just thought about, the condemnation of, for example, usury, economic exploitation, sexual deviancy. These are repeated in Isaiah, and also the idea that you violated the covenant, and the idea that if you return to the covenant, if you renew your ties with Jehovah and give up your sins, the Jews will be restored to the promised land. Jehovah will give them back the promised land. That's the basic idea. But I would say that Isaiah 2 goes a step further, because we know that he probably lived in Mesopotamia. In any case, he kicks it up a notch. He takes it a step further, because he says that you have to understand the Jews, or what he calls, and this is the term, the righteous remnant of the Jews, as a suffering servant. And the Jews' suffering is not merely about them. It's about universal redemption. At the end of the day, when the Jews repent and renew the covenant, there will come about universal human redemption, which by that, Isaiah means peace, the brotherhood of all nations, peace and the brotherhood of all nations, with Israel occupying a special status. There is in this, so what I'm saying is that by the time you get to this point, the end of the 6th century BC, you have an ethical, universal monotheism enunciated by the prophets. And it's notable, here I'll be finishing, that Isaiah lived in Babylon. He lived in Mesopotamia. He wasn't living in a backwater. He was living in a highly cosmopolitan, in exile, in a highly cosmopolitan society. And in this context, he invents this new universal kind of religious ideology. Well, I'll finish this off in the next class.